Two armored tanks do not just crush the median of a flooded Seattle highway unless the world is ending or an angel is missing. The storm lashed against the windshields of terrified drivers as the massive Stryker vehicles ground to a halt, blocking 4 lanes of traffic. But the soldiers leaping into the mud weren't hunting a terrorist. They were hunting a savior. A giant sergeant sprinted toward a 50-year-old woman shivering in her scrubs, clutching a wet cardboard box. He didn't arrest her. He knelt in the filth before her. "Ma'am, are you the one who sang to him?" When she nodded, terrified, he tapped his radio. "Tell the general we found her." She was fired for humming a lullaby to a dying homeless man. She didn't know that homeless man was a special forces commander, and he had just sent his army to bring her home. The rain in Seattle didn't just fall, it besieged the city. For 3 days, the sky had been a bruised, heavy charcoal, unleashing a deluge that turned the gutters of First Hill into rushing rivers, and the windows of Mercy General Hospital into shimmering, weeping sheets of glass. The wind howled around the corners of the concrete building, a mournful soprano accompanying the chaotic bass line of thunder that shook the very foundations of the earth. Inside, the lights flickered, a nervous tick in the hospital's electrical grid, casting long, dancing shadows across the overflowing corridors. Clara Vance adjusted the strap of her watch, a simple analog piece with a worn leather band that she had worn for 20 years. At 50, Clara was a woman built of soft edges and sturdy resolve. Her graying hair was pulled back into a practical, no-nonsense bun, revealing a face etched with the kind of laugh lines that only come from decades of reassuring smiles. She wore scrubs that were clean but slightly faded, and her shoes were sensible, orthotic clogs that made no sound as she moved. She was a relic in this modern facility, a nurse who still believed in the warmth of a hand over the cold precision of a monitor. Tonight, the emergency room was a war zone of a different kind. The storm had caused a 20-car pileup on I-5, and the trauma bay was at capacity. Every bed was full, every doctor was shouting, and the air smelled of wet wool, antiseptic, and fear. Because there were no rooms left, Gurney 4 had been pushed into a dim alcove near the vending machines. Lying there was a man listed only as John Doe. He was massive, his frame taking up the entire width of the narrow bed. His face was heavily bandaged, leaving only a strong, square jaw and a pair of eyes currently squeezed shut in agony visible. His body was a map of trauma. Shrapnel scars on his shoulders, fresh sutures on his side, and bruises that bloomed like dark violets across his chest. He was trembling, a subtle vibration that rattled the metal rails of the gurney. "Easy now," Clara whispered, stepping into the alcove. She didn't look at the flashing monitor that showed his heart rate spiking to 140. She looked at his hands. They were clenched into fists so tight his knuckles were white. Suddenly, a clap of thunder detonated directly over the hospital. The lights surged and dimmed. The man on the gurney gasped, his eyes flying open. They were steel gray, wide with a terror that didn't belong in a hospital hallway. It was the terror of a battlefield. "Contact! Front!" he rasped, his voice a ruined growl. He tried to sit up, thrashing against the sheets, his mind clearly thousands of miles away, in a desert, not a rainy city. "Get down! Incoming!" 2 younger nurses, barely out of school, froze near the nurses' station. One of them, a girl with bright pink scrubs, reached for the crash cart. "He's combatant. Dr. Thorne said to sedate him if he thrashes. I'm getting the haloperidol." "No," Clara said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that stopped the younger nurse in her tracks. "Put the needle down, Sarah. He's not dangerous. He's scared." Clara moved closer, ignoring the way the man's arm flailed out, nearly striking her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she reached out and firmly took his clenched fist in her warm, 2-handed grip. "You are safe," Clara said, pitching her voice low and resonant. "You are in Seattle. It is raining. Listen to the rain, soldier. Just rain." The man blinked, sweat stinging his eyes. He looked at her, but he didn't see her. He saw ghosts. He pulled against her grip, his breathing jagged and panic-stricken. Clara knew medicine couldn't fix this. This was a wound of the soul. She did what she had done for 30 years. She reached into her pocket, pulled out a small, tattered notebook with a spine held together by tape, and glanced at a note she had written earlier about his vitals. Then, She put it away and leaned in close. She began to hum. It was a low, melodic sound, a vibration that started in her chest. It was an old folk tune, The Wayfaring Stranger, a song her grandmother had sung to her during the thunderstorms of her childhood. I'm just a poor wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world of woe. The melody cut through the sterile beep of the monitors. It was human. It was imperfect. And it was exactly what the man needed. The man's eyes locked onto Clara's face. The gray irises focused. The thrashing stopped. He listened to the hum, a lifeline thrown into the dark ocean of his trauma. Slowly, miraculously, his grip on the sheets loosened. His heart rate on the monitor began to drop. 130, 110, 90. That's it, Clara whispered, smoothing the hair back from his sweat-drenched forehead. Just rest. I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere. Touching performance, Nurse Vance. Truly, perhaps we should charge admission. The voice cut through the moment like a scalpel. Clara stiffened and turned. Dr. Julian Thorne stood at the end of the hallway. He was a man who wore his arrogance like a second skin. Even at 2 a.m., his white coat was pristine, worn over a tailored Italian suit that cost more than Clara's car. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with slicked-back dark hair and eyes that constantly scanned the room for advantage. But tonight, there was a sheen of sweat on his upper lip, and he kept tapping his fingers against his thigh, a telltale sign of a man whose gambling debts were coming due. Thorne walked over, wrinkling his nose as he looked at the patient. He didn't see a suffering veteran. He saw a non-paying liability occupying a bed he desperately needed to sell to a wealthy donor who had just called with a minor injury. Dr. Thorne, Clara said, standing protectively between the doctor and the patient. He was having an episode. He's stable now. He is occupying a gurney in my hallway, unbilled and unidentified, Thorne snapped, checking his expensive watch. And you are singing to him. This is a hospital, Vance, not a daycare center. Thorne's eyes dropped to the pocket of Clara's scrub top, where the corner of her battered notebook poked out. He let out a cruel, barking laugh. And still using that ridiculous diary, Thorne sneered, reaching out and snatching the notebook from her pocket before she could react. He flipped through it, mocking the handwritten pages. Look at this. Patient cold, gave extra blanket. Patient lonely, sat for 10 minutes. You are a relic, Clara. You waste time. You waste resources. And frankly, you are a liability to the efficiency I am trying to build here. That notebook contains more truth about these patients than your computer ever will, Clara said, her voice shaking slightly with suppressed anger. And this man needs care. He has severe infection markers. You can't move him. Watch me, Thorne hissed, leaning in close. The smell of expensive cologne and stale scotch assaulted Clara's senses. I have a city councilman coming in with a fractured wrist in 10 minutes. I need this space. As for you, I've been looking for a reason. Ignoring protocol, refusing sedation orders, carrying unauthorized personal items. Thorne tossed the notebook onto the floor. It landed in a puddle of melted ice from a spilled cup. You're fired, Clara. Get your things, and get him. He pointed a manicured finger at the man on the gurney. Out of my hospital. Call security. Tell them we have a vagrant trespassing. You can't do that, Clara gasped. He'll die out there. Not my problem. Thorne turned his back. Security! 15 minutes later, the automatic doors of the emergency rooms slid open, and the storm swallowed Clara whole. The wind hit her like a physical blow, nearly knocking the breath from her lungs. She stood on the sidewalk, shivering violently. She wore only her thin scrubs and a cheap cardigan. In her arms, she clutched a soggy cardboard box containing a coffee mug, a framed photo of a three-legged dog, and her ruined notebook, which she had rescued from the floor. Beside her, leaning heavily against the concrete wall, was the John Doe. He had been forcefully escorted out by 2 apologetic but obedient security guards. He was barely conscious, his hospital gown soaked through in seconds. I can walk, the man stammered, his teeth chattering. He tried to take a step and nearly collapsed. Lean on me, Clara said, dropping her box. The mug shattered, but she didn't care. She wedged her shoulder under the giant man's arm. Come on, my car is... Oh, God, she remembered. She had taken the bus because her transmission had failed last week. The buses had stopped running due to the storm. They were stranded. "We have to keep moving," Clara yelled over the roar of the rain. "There's a gas station a mile down the road. They have a shelter." They began to walk. It was a pathetic, agonizing procession. A 50-year-old unemployed nurse supporting a broken warrior, trudging along the shoulder of Route 99. Cars splashed freezing sludge onto them as they sped by, red taillights blurring in the mist. Clara's legs burned. The man was heavy, a dead weight of muscle and bone. Her tears mixed with the rain. She had given 30 years to Mercy General. She had missed Christmases, birthdays, and her own son's graduation to care for strangers. And this was her reward, to be discarded like trash in the gutter. "Leave me," the man groaned, stumbling. "You go." "Shut up," Clara said, gritting her teeth. "I'm not leaving you. I don't leave people." They had walked perhaps half a mile when the vibration started. At first, Clara thought it was thunder rolling through the pavement, but it didn't fade. It grew. It was a deep mechanical thrumming that resonated in the soles of her shoes and rattled her teeth. The puddles on the road began to ripple in concentric circles. Then came the sound. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of civilian engines. It was a guttural, earth-shaking roar. The roar of diesel predators. Clara froze, wiping rain from her eyes. "What is that?" Ahead of them, the traffic coming toward them screeched to a halt. Cars swerved onto the grass. Headlights blinded her. Through the wall of rain, two shapes emerged. They were massive, 8-wheeled monsters of matte green steel, bristling with antennas and armor. Stryker armored combat vehicles. They weren't moving with the flow of traffic. They were driving down the wrong side of the road, crushing the median divider like it was styrofoam. The lead vehicle's turret turned, the black eye of a heavy machine gun scanning the darkness. Clara's heart stopped. She instinctively tried to shield the man with her small body. "Stay behind me," she whispered, though she knew it was useless against a tank. The lead Stryker slammed on its brakes, the tires screeching on the wet asphalt, stopping mere feet from Clara. The heat from the massive engine washed over her, smelling of hot oil and power. The rear ramp of the vehicle hissed and began to lower, revealing the red glow of the troop compartment inside. Clara stood her ground, trembling, wet, and terrified. She raised her chin, clutching her sodden notebook to her chest, ready to defend her patient against the entire world. The ramp of the lead Stryker hit the wet asphalt with a heavy, metallic clang that vibrated through the soles of Clara's shoes. Steam hissed as the hot metal met the freezing rain, creating a swirling gray fog around the gaping maw of the vehicle. Clara did not run. She couldn't. Her legs were frozen, not just from the cold, but from a paralyzing cocktail of fear and confusion. She stood protectively over the slumped form of the man she knew only as John Doe, shielding his face from the blinding headlights. "Stay back!" she screamed, her voice cracking against the roar of the engines. "He's injured! You can't touch him!" Figures emerged from the red-lit interior of the troop compartment. They moved with the fluid, terrifying precision of predators. They were clad in full tactical gear, helmets with night vision mounts, body armor that added inches to their chests, and drop-leg holsters. These were not police. They were not standard infantry. They were something else entirely. The soldier in the lead was a mountain of a man. Even in the crouched posture required to exit the vehicle, he loomed over everything. He stepped onto the road, water cascading off his shoulders like a waterfall hitting a boulder. He wore a patch on his shoulder, depicting a dagger wrapped in lightning. This was Sergeant Major Jackson Miller, known to his squad as Tiny due to his 6'6" frame and the iron shovel size of his hands. Miller walked straight toward Clara. He didn't raise a weapon. He didn't shout commands. He ignored the cars stopped on the highway, the honking horns, and the chaotic storm. He stopped 3 feet from her, towering over her small, shivering frame. Clara clutched her sodden notebook like a shield. "I won't let you take him to jail," she stammered, her teeth chattering. "He hasn't done anything." Miller looked down at her. His face, visible under the rim of his helmet, was scarred and weather-beaten, with eyes that had seen too much of the world's ugliness. He looked at the unconscious man leaning against Clara, then back at the fierce little woman holding him up. Then, the giant did the impossible. Slowly, deliberately, Sergeant Major Miller sank into the mud. He bent one knee, lowering himself until he was eye level with Clara. The other soldiers behind him immediately followed suit, 6 highly trained operators kneeling in the pouring rain on a public highway. "Ma'am," Miller's voice was a deep rumble, surprisingly soft for a man of his size. "We aren't here to arrest him. We're here to save him." Clara blinked, rain dripping from her eyelashes. Who is he?" "That is Captain Elias Sterling," Miller said, reverence coloring his tone. "He's the commander of the 1st Ranger Battalion, and we've been monitoring his vitals via his implant for 3 hours. We lost the signal when he was moved outside." Miller paused, rainwater dripping from his nose. The telemetry picked up audio before the signal cut. He was panicking. His heart rate was critical. And then it stopped. "We heard humming, ma'am. We heard a song." Clara tightened her grip on the captain's shoulder. "I was just trying to calm him down." "You did more than that," Miller said. "Since the ambush in Kandahar, no one has been able to bring him down from a jagged edge. Not the doctors, not the psychs, just you. He responds to your voice." Miller extended a massive gloved hand, palm up. It was an invitation, not a demand. "Please, ma'am, the captain needs you. We can't treat him. Only you can." Clara looked at the hand, then at the suffering man beside her. The anger that had fueled her walk down the highway evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of duty. She wasn't just a fired nurse anymore. She was necessary. "Help me get him up," Clara commanded softly. Miller didn't hesitate. He moved with surprising gentleness, scooping Captain Sterling up into his arms as if the 200-pound man weighed nothing. Another soldier draped a dry thermal blanket around Clara's shoulders. "After you, ma'am," Miller said, gesturing to the open ramp of the striker. They didn't shove her in the back of a police cruiser. They ushered her into the armored beast like she was royalty ascending a throne. As the ramp closed, sealing out the storm and the cold, Clara sat on the bench seat, bathed in the red tactical light. The engine roared and the vehicle spun around, its tires tearing up the median as it headed back the way it came, straight toward Mercy General. Inside the executive suite on the top floor of Mercy General, the storm felt distant, muffled by layers of soundproof glass. But for Dr. Julian Thorne, the atmosphere was suffocating. Thorne paced the length of his Persian rug, a glass of amber scotch trembling in his hand. He had watched the security feed. He had seen the black shapes on the monitors before the cameras shorted out from the lightning. He didn't know exactly who was coming, but he knew men in armored vehicles didn't show up for vagrants unless a massive mistake had been made. "Think, Julian, think," he muttered, knocking back the scotch. He rushed to his mahogany desk and woke his computer. The screen cast a pale, ghostly light on his sweating face. His fingers flew across the keyboard. He wasn't checking emails. He was purging history. He accessed the patient intake logs. There it was. Entry 8940. John Doe, admitted 23 weeks, vitals unstable. Thorne hit delete. A prompt popped up. Administrator override required. Thorne typed in his password, his breath hitching. Access granted. The record vanished. Next, he went into the security logs. He found the footage of him confronting Clara in the hallway. He found the timestamps of the discharge order. Select all, erase. "It never happened," he whispered to himself, a manic grin twitching at the corner of his mouth. He was never here. The nurse, she was delusional. She kidnapped a homeless man from the street. I never treated him. I never saw him. He was rewriting reality. If Sterling died, there would be no paper trail leading back to Thorne's negligence. No record of the sepsis he ignored. No record of the eviction into the storm. It was the perfect crime, executed with the click of a mouse. Suddenly, the building shook. A vibration deeper than thunder rattled the crystal decanter on his shelf. Thorne ran to the window. Down below, the front gates of the hospital, heavy steel barriers designed to stop trucks, were being crushed like aluminum foil. The strikers didn't wait for the code. They simply drove through them. Thorne paled. He grabbed his tablet, straightened his tie, and practiced his most indignant, authoritative expression in the reflection of the window. He had to play the victim. He had to be the outraged administrator whose facility was being invaded. The lobby of Mercy General was usually a place of hushed whispers and squeaking rubber shoes. Now it was a landing zone. The automatic doors had been propped open. A phalanx of rangers secured the perimeter, their presence turning the sterile white room into a forward operating base. Nurses and orderlies huddled behind the reception desk, eyes wide with terror and awe. Clara walked through the center of the chaos. She wasn't wet and shivering anymore. She was burning with purpose. Sergeant Major Miller walked a step behind her, a silent, hulking guardian. "What is the meaning of this?" Thorne's voice echoed from the mezzanine. He descended the grand staircase, his white coat billowing, flanked by two confused hospital security guards. "This is a private facility," Thorne shouted, pointing a finger at the soldiers. "You are trespassing. I will have your badges. I will sue the Department of Defense into bankruptcy." He reached the bottom of the stairs and lunged toward Clara. "And you! I told you to leave. Bringing armed thugs back to threaten me? This is criminal trespassing. Stand down." The command didn't come from Miller. It came from the entrance. A man walked in, leaning on a polished black cane, though he moved with the momentum of a freight train. He wore a dress uniform adorned with 3 stars on the shoulder. His hair was silver, cut high and tight, and his face was carved from granite. This was General Thomas Ironwood, commander of Joint Special Operations Command. He was a man who ate politicians for breakfast and dismantled warlords for lunch. Ironwood walked past Thorne as if the doctor were a piece of furniture. He stopped in front of Clara. He looked at her wet scrubs, her tired eyes, and the fiercely clutched notebook in her hand. "Mrs. Vance," Ironwood said, his voice gravel and steel, "my men tell me you were the only one who kept my boy alive tonight." I just did my job, General," Clara said softly. "He's in Trauma Bay 1. Miller took him there." Ironwood nodded, a microscopic softening in his eyes. He turned slowly to face Thorne. Thorne swallowed hard, his bluster deflating under the weight of the general's gaze. "General, look, there has been a misunderstanding. This nurse was fired for incompetence. She endangered the patient." "Silence," Ironwood said. It wasn't a shout. It was a fact. The general stepped closer to Thorne, forcing the doctor to step back until he hit the reception desk. "We tracked the captain's telemetry, Doctor. We know exactly when his heart rate spiked. We know exactly when he was moved outdoors into a storm. And we know exactly when you logged into the server 5 minutes ago to scrub the files." Thorne's face drained of blood. That's privileged information." "This is now a military operation," Ironwood announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the lobby. "Mercy General is under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Army until further notice." He pointed his cane at Clara. "Nurse Vance is effectively reinstated. Furthermore, she is the officer in charge of Captain Sterling's medical detail. She outranks you, Doctor. She outranks your board of directors. If she asks for a scalpel, you hand it to her. If she asks for the moon, you start building a rocket." Thorne looked at Clara, the woman he had called a relic, the woman he had discarded. Now she held his career and his life in her hands. "This is preposterous," Thorne hissed, his voice low and venomous. "She's a nurse. She doesn't have the clearance." Sergeant Major Miller stepped forward, his chest bumping Thorne back. "She has the general's clearance, sir." Thorne smoothed his lapels, his eyes narrowing into slits. He realized he couldn't win a physical fight. Not here, not now. But the hospital was still his domain. The servers were his, the drugs were his. "Very well," Thorne said, a slippery cold smile touching his lips. "We will accommodate the hero." He looked at Clara one last time. It wasn't a look of defeat. It was the look of a viper coiling in the grass, waiting for the boot to pass so it could strike the heel. "Trauma 1 is prepped," Thorne said smoothly. "I'll be in my office if the commander needs me." As Thorne turned to walk away, Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. She watched him go, clutching her notebook tighter. She had the army at her back, but she knew, with a deep, sinking dread, that the war inside these walls had only just begun. Trauma Bay 1 had been transformed into a fortress. 2 rangers stood guard outside the double doors, their rifles held at the low ready, statues carved from multicam and Kevlar. Inside, however, the atmosphere was less military and more maternal. The harsh fluorescent overheads had been dimmed to a soft amber glow, and the rhythmic whoosh hiss of the ventilator had been replaced by the steady beep of the cardiac monitor. Clara Vance pulled a plastic chair up to the bedside. On the tray table sat a bowl of lukewarm chicken broth and a small cup of water. "Open," Clara said. It wasn't a request. Captain Elias Sterling lay propped up on 3 pillows. His face was still largely obscured by thick white gauze, leaving only his mouth, jaw, and those piercing, haunted gray eyes exposed. He stared at the wall, refusing to look at the spoon hovering near his lips. "I'm not hungry," he rasped. His voice was a ruin, sounding like tires crunching over gravel. "Let me be, Clara. You've done enough." "You're right, I have," Clara replied, her tone sharp but not unkind. "I walked 2 miles in a hurricane. I defied a doctor who makes more in a week than I make in a year, and I rode in a tank. I didn't do all that so you could starve to death in a warm bed." She tapped the spoon against his lower lip. "Open." Sterling sighed, a sound of immense exhaustion, and parted his lips. He swallowed the broth mechanically, without tasting it. "Why?" he asked after the 3rd spoonful. "Why do you care? I'm just a broken weapon. That's what Thorne called me." "Thorne is an idiot in an expensive suit," Clara said, dipping the spoon again. "And you aren't a weapon, you're a man. I had a son, Elias. His name was Michael." Sterling's eyes shifted, finally meeting hers. "Had?" "He died 10 years ago," Clara said. She didn't stop feeding him, her hand steady. "Motorcycle accident. He was 22. He had big hands like you, and he was stubborn. He wouldn't wear a helmet because he said it messed up his hair." She paused, looking at the broth. "I couldn't save him. I was on shift here when they brought him in. I held his hand while he slipped away. So, don't you dare tell me to let you be. When I see a boy, and you are just a boy to me, Captain, fighting to stay here, I'm going to make sure he stays." Sterling closed his eyes. A single tear leaked from the corner, tracking a path through the grime and antiseptic on his cheek. "I lost my whole team," he whispered. "The ambush, I should have seen it. I shouldn't be here." "That's survivor's guilt talking," Clara said softly, wiping his cheek with a cloth. "It's a liar. You're here because you have work left to do. Now, eat." 3 floors up, in the darkened sanctuary of his office, Dr. Julian Thorne was also working. But his tools were not spoons and broth. They were code and malice. The hospital was under martial law, yes. General Ironwood's goons were at every exit. But Ironwood was a soldier, a man of bullets and brute force. He didn't understand that the modern hospital was not a building of brick and mortar. It was a digital organism, and Thorne was its architect. He sat bathed in the blue light of his monitors, his fingers dancing across a mechanical keyboard. He couldn't physically enter Trauma 1. That giant Sergeant Major Miller would break his neck before he got within 10 feet. But he didn't need to enter the room to kill the patient. "Let's see," Thorne murmured, a cold smile playing on his lips. He accessed the central pharmacy server. The hospital used an automated dispensing cabinet, ADC system. Nurses didn't go to a shelf and pick a bottle. They typed a code into a machine, and a drawer popped open with the specific medication. It was designed to prevent error. Thorne knew it was the perfect vehicle for murder. He pulled up Sterling's file. He couldn't delete it anymore. The military IT guys were watching the main logs. But he could tweak the inventory mapping. He found the entry for epinephrine 1/1000, a standard stimulant used to support blood pressure in trauma patients. Sterling was scheduled for a maintenance dose in 20 minutes to keep his heart rate steady. Thorne opened the command line for the ADC unit inside Trauma 1. With a few keystrokes, he swapped the bin assignment. Bin 42. Epinephrine was remapped to bin 18, potassium chloride concentrate. Potassium chloride. It was a common electrolyte, harmless in small, diluted doses, but in concentrated form, injected rapidly. It was the chemical used in judicial executions. It stopped the heart instantly. No pain, just lights out. "System error," Thorne whispered, typing the final execute command. "A tragic glitch in the firmware. Unfortunate. Unpreventable." He leaned back in his leather chair, watching the progress bar hit 100%. To the nurse at the station, the screen would say epinephrine, but the drawer that popped open would hand her a loaded gun. Back in Trauma 1, the peace was broken by the sharp chime of the vitals monitor. BP is dipping, Clara noted, looking at the screen. 90/60. He needs his scheduled presser. The door opened and a nurse entered. It was Emily, a young woman in her mid-20s with bright, anxious eyes and colorful cartoon characters on her lanyard. She was new, part of the generation that trusted technology implicitly. She was terrified of the Rangers outside, and even more terrified of Clara, whose reputation as the Dragon Lady of the ER had only grown since the tank incident. "Mrs. Vance," Emily squeaked, "I'm here for the 0300 meds. Dr. Thorne, the protocol says 1 minute of epi." "Go ahead, Emily," Clara said, standing up to stretch her aching back. "I'll hold his line." Emily went to the dispensing machine in the corner of the room. She scanned her fingerprint. Beep. She typed in Sterling. Beep. She selected epinephrine. Clack. A drawer popped open. Emily reached in and grabbed the small glass vial. She didn't look at it closely. Why would she? The machine was never wrong. The screen said epinephrine. The drawer opened for epinephrine. She walked to the prep counter, uncapped a syringe, and plunged the needle into the rubber stopper of the vial. She drew up the clear liquid. "Okay," Emily said, moving toward the IV port on Sterling's arm. "Just a little boost, Captain. This will help your pressure." Clara was standing by Sterling's head, smoothing his pillow. As Emily approached, the overhead light caught the glass vial still clutched in her left hand. Something triggered in Clara's brain. It wasn't a conscious thought. It was a reflex honed by 30 years of handling thousands of drugs. It was the pattern recognition of a master craftsman. Epinephrine vials usually had a brown or purple band. The vial in Emily's hand had a black cap with red lettering. Time seemed to slow down. Emily uncapped the needle. She was inches from the IV port. "Stop." Clara didn't speak. She lunged. She moved with the speed of a striking cobra, her hand chopping down on Emily's wrist. The syringe flew across the room, smashing against the far wall. The clear liquid splattered onto the linoleum. "What are you doing?" Emily screamed, shrinking back, clutching her wrist. "You're crazy!" The two Rangers burst through the door instantly, rifles raised, sweeping the room for a threat. "Contact! What's happening?" Clara ignored them. She ignored the terrified Emily. She scrambled across the floor on her hands and knees and grabbed the discarded empty vial that had rolled under the bed. She held it up to the light. The red warning text screamed at her. "Potassium chloride concentrate. Must be diluted. Lethal if injected undiluted." Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at the syringe shards, then at Sterling's IV line. If she had been 2 seconds slower. "Emily," Clara said, her voice trembling with a cold, terrifying rage. "Look at this vial. Read it." Emily stepped forward, shaking. She read the label. Her hands flew to her mouth. Oh my God, the machine. It said, Epi. I swear, Mrs. Vance, the machine gave it to me. Sergeant Major Miller entered the room, holstering his sidearm, but keeping his hand near it. He looked at the shattered glass, then at Clara's face. "Ma'am?" "Someone tried to kill him," Clara said, standing up. She held the vial out to Miller like it was a piece of evidence in a murder trial. The machine dispensed potassium chloride instead of adrenaline. If she had pushed this, his heart would have stopped in 10 seconds. Miller took the vial. His face darkened, his jaw clenching so hard a muscle jumped in his cheek. "The machine made a mistake?" "Machines don't make mistakes like this," Clara spat. She looked up at the ceiling, as if she could see through the concrete floors to the executive suite above. "Machines do what they are told. Someone swapped the inventory codes." Emily was sobbing in the corner. "I didn't check. I trusted the drawer." Clara walked over to the young nurse. She didn't scold her. She placed a hand on her shoulder. "This is why we read the label, Emily. Every single time. We don't trust computers. We trust our eyes." She turned back to Miller. "Lock down the pharmacy system. Cut the network cables. If they can hack the dispenser, they can hack the ventilators. From now on, nothing touches this patient unless I taste it, read it, and approve it. We go analog, completely analog." Miller tapped his headset. "Command, we have an assassination attempt via digital sabotage. Suspect is internal. I want a team on the server room, and I want eyes on Thorn. On the bed, Captain Sterling had watched the entire scene in silence. He looked at the splatter of liquid on the wall, the death that had missed him by inches. Then he looked at Clara, the small, gray-haired woman who was currently barking orders at a special forces operator. "Clara!" he rasped. She turned to him, her face softening instantly. "I'm here." "You have good reflexes," he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his bandaged lips. "I raised a teenage boy," Clara said, pulling the blanket up to his chin. "You learn to move fast. Now, get some sleep. I'm going to sit right here, and I promise you, the only thing coming through that door is me." The silence in trauma. One was heavier than the storm outside. The machines had been disconnected, their screens dark and lifeless, replaced by Clara's fingers pressed gently against Captain Sterling's wrist. She counted the beats, her lips moving silently, her eyes fixed on the analog clock on the wall. "Pulse is thready," she announced, her voice tight. "Rate is dropping, 45 beats per minute." General Ironwood stood in the corner, his imposing frame casting a long shadow. Beside him, Sergeant Major Miller looked ready to punch a wall. They had secured the room, they had stopped the assassination attempt, but they were losing the war against the biology inside Sterling's veins. "The blood work is back," a young lab technician said, rushing in with a paper slip, breathless. He had run the samples manually, using reagents and microscopes instead of the automated analyzers. "It's not just sepsis, it's a neurotoxin. The molecular structure looks synthetic, mimicking the venom of the Bungarus multicinctus, the Taiwanese crate." "A neurotoxin?" Ironwood growled. "How?" "The shrapnel," Sterling whispered from the bed, his eyes barely open. "The tips were coated." Clara looked at the paper. "If it's crate venom, he needs the anti-venom immediately. Paralysis will set in within the hour. His diaphragm will stop working, and he'll suffocate." "We have standard antivenin in the pharmacy," Miller said, reaching for his radio. "No," Clara cut him off. "Standard won't work on a synthetic variant. You need the polyvalent Series 4 serum. It was an experimental batch produced 20 years ago for jungle warfare. It was discontinued because it was too expensive to make." "Where do we get it?" Ironwood asked. "The main hospital stock doesn't have it," Clara said, her mind racing back through decades of inventory logs stored in her memory. "Thorn would have thrown it out years ago to make room for Botox, but the old annex." "The annex?" Miller asked. "The immense storage warehouse down in the Sodo district," Clara explained. "Before everything went digital, that's where we kept the disaster reserves. I was the supply manager there in the late 90s. I personally cataloged the Series 4 crates. They were in the sub-basement, inside a lead-lined cold storage vault. It's nuclear grade. It would survive anything." "Sodo is underwater," Miller said grimly. "The levees broke an hour ago. The water level is at 12 feet and rising. The streets are a river." "We have boats," Ironwood said, turning to the door. "I have a SEAL team on standby for extraction. Lieutenant Graves is commanding the Zodiacs in the parking lot." "I'm going," Clara said. She began stripping off her thin cardigan and reaching for a heavy waterproof trauma jacket hanging on the hook. "Negative," Ironwood said. "It's a war zone out there, Mrs. Vance. My men can retrieve a box." "Your men don't know the layout," Clara argued, fastening the jacket. "The digital blueprints for that building haven't been updated since 2005. The renovations in 2010 walled off the main stairwell. The only way down to the vault is a service chute behind the old break room that isn't on any map. If they go in blind, they'll drown looking for a door that doesn't exist. You need a guide." She walked up to the general, looking him dead in the eye. "You said I was in charge. You said if I asked for the moon, you'd build a rocket. Well, I'm asking for a boat." Ironwood stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Miller, stay with the captain. If Thorn even breathes in the hallway, break his legs." The transition from the sterile silence of the hospital to the roar of the outside world was jarring. The wind screamed like a banshee, whipping the rain into horizontal needles. Waiting in the flooded parking lot was a sleek black inflatable Zodiac boat, its engine idling with a low purr. At the helm stood Lieutenant Sharkey Graves. He was a man who looked like he had been born underwater, lean, wiry, with pale skin and eyes that were almost entirely black. He wore a wetsuit and tactical vest, a knife strapped to his calf. "You the cargo?" Graves shouted over the wind as Clara climbed awkwardly into the rubber boat. "I'm the navigator," Clara shouted back, gripping the safety rope. "And we don't have time for small talk. Go." Graves grinned, a sharp, dangerous expression. "Hang on, Grandma." The boat surged forward, the engine roaring as it cut through the murky water. They didn't drive on the road, they drove over it. The streetlights were mere stumps sticking out of the swirling black flood. Cars floated past them, bobbing like apples in a barrel, their alarms blaring in a discordant symphony. The journey to the Sodo district was a descent into hell. The water was thick with debris, tree branches, dumpsters, pieces of houses. The storm had turned Seattle into a dark, Venice-like nightmare. "Left at the intersection," Clara pointed. "The current is too strong on the main avenue." Graves wrestled the tiller, swinging the boat around a submerged bus. "Good call. That current would have smashed us into the overpass." They arrived at the old annex 20 minutes later. It was a brick monolith, the first floor completely submerged. The water lapped hungrily at the second-story windows. "We go in through the loading bay roof," Clara directed. "There's a skylight." Graves killed the engine, drifting the boat alongside the corrugated metal roof of the loading dock. He and two other SEALs leaped out, moving with cat-like grace on the slippery metal. They cut the glass of the skylight and dropped a rope ladder. "Stay close to me," Graves told Clara as he helped her harness up. "The water inside is stagnant, toxic. Do not swallow it." They descended into the darkness. Inside, the warehouse was a cavern of shadows and echoes. The water level here was lower, waist-deep on the main floor, black as ink. Their tactical flashlights cut beams through the gloom, illuminating rows of rusting shelving units that loomed like skeletons. "This way," Clara whispered. She didn't need a map. She closed her eyes for a second, smelling the old dust and mildew, remembering the days when she walked these aisles with a clipboard. Past the forklift charging station, then right. They waded through the muck. Rats swam past them, squeaking in terror. "Here!" Clara stopped in front of a nondescript wall covered in peeling paint. "This used to be the break room. The service chute is behind this panel." Graves pried the panel open with a crowbar. Behind it was a narrow, spiraling metal staircase leading down into the submerged sub-basement. "It's fully flooded," Graves noted, shining his light down. The water reflected back like a black mirror. "The vault is underwater." "The vault is watertight," Clara said. "The serum is in sealed glass ampoules inside a lead box. It will be dry." "I'll go down," Graves said. "You don't know which box," Clara grabbed his arm. "There are 1,000 boxes down there, Lieutenant. They are labeled with alphanumeric codes that changed 3 times in the 90s. Code 4 Alpha Red. If you grab the wrong one, we waste time we don't have." Graves looked at her. "Can you hold your breath?" "I was the diving champion of my high school swim team," Clara lied. She hadn't swum in 30 years. "Give me the regulator." Graves handed her a spare emergency breather, a small canister of compressed air with a mouthpiece. 2 minutes of air. Don't panic." They took a deep breath and submerged. The cold was instantaneous and agonizing. It felt like 1,000 knives stabbing her skin. Clara followed the beam of Graves' light, pulling herself down the railing. The pressure built in her ears. They reached the bottom. It was a graveyard of crates. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She scanned the rows, her eyes stinging in the murky water. There, third shelf from the bottom, a gray metal box with a faded red stripe. Series 4. She pointed. Graves swam forward, smashed the rusty padlock with the butt of his dive knife, and pried the lid open. Inside, nestled in decaying foam, was a silver case. Clara grabbed it. She gave the thumbs up. They began to ascend. As they broke the surface of the water in the break room, gasping for air, a deep groan echoed through the building. "Structural failure!" Graves yelled. "The water pressure is collapsing the foundation. Move!" They scrambled up the spiral stairs, splashing through the waist-deep water on the main floor toward the skylight. The walls began to buckle. Pipes burst, spraying high-pressure water across the room. They reached the rope ladder. "You first!" Graves shoved Clara upward. She climbed, the heavy silver case tucked into her jacket. She was halfway up when the east wall of the warehouse exploded inward. A massive surge of floodwater, released from a breaking levee nearby, hit the building like a battering ram. The force of the water knocked the ladder sideways. Clara lost her grip. She fell. She hit the black water hard. The current grabbed her instantly, spinning her around, dragging her toward a jagged hole in the floor where the foundation had given way. "Clara!" Graves screamed, diving after her. The water was a monster. It sucked her down, heavy debris slamming into her ribs. Her lungs burned. The darkness swallowed her. "Let go of the box!" a voice in her head screamed. "Swim with two hands?" No. If she let go, Sterling died. It was that simple. Clara curled her body around the silver case, tucking it against her stomach. She kicked with everything she had, fighting the whirlpool. Her hand brushed against something, a rusted rebar sticking out of the concrete. She grabbed it. The metal tore her palm, but she held on. The current whipped her legs like a rag doll. Suddenly, a hand clamped onto the back of her jacket. It was Graves. He had tied a rope around his waist and dived into the churn. He hauled her up, fighting the current with sheer brute strength. They broke the surface, gasping, coughing up brackish water. The other SEALs on the roof hauled on the rope, dragging them both up through the skylight just as the floor of the warehouse collapsed completely into the sinkhole below. They lay on the corrugated metal roof, battered, bleeding, and soaked. The rain poured down on them. Graves rolled over, chest heaving. "You okay, ma'am?" Clara lay on her back, clutching the silver case to her chest. She was shaking violently from hypothermia, blood from her hand mixing with the rain. She looked at the box. It was dented, but intact. She coughed, water spilling from her lips. "I got it." Graves laughed, a breathless, incredulous sound. "Yeah, you got it. You're crazy, you know that?" "Let's go," Clara whispered, forcing herself to sit up. He's waiting. The adrenaline from the Sodo warehouse raid had begun to fade, replaced by a bone-deep chill that settled into the marrow of Clara Vance's bones. She sat by Captain Sterling's bedside, her hands bandaged where the rusty rebar had torn her skin. The precious silver case lay open on the table, the empty glass ampule glinting in the low light. She had administered the polyvalent Series 4 serum 10 minutes ago. Now, all they could do was wait. Sterling's breathing was shallow, the rhythmic hiss-click of the ventilator the only sound in the room. His color was still ashen, but the violent tremors that had racked his body earlier had subsided. "He's fighting," Clara whispered to the room at large. General Ironwood stood by the window, peering through the blinds at the storm-lashed city below. "He's a ranger, Mrs. Vance. Fighting is the only thing he knows." But 3 floors above them, the war had changed fronts. Dr. Julian Thorne sat in the darkness of his executive suite, the glow of his laptop screen illuminating a face slick with cold sweat. His phone, lying on the mahogany desk, buzzed with a vibration that sounded like an angry hornet. Thorne stared at it. He didn't want to answer. He knew who it was. The screen lit up. Unknown caller. He tapped the speaker icon with a trembling finger. "Thorne here." "Doctor?" The voice on the other end was distorted, synthetic, stripped of humanity. It wasn't a person. It was a death sentence. "The asset is still breathing. Our biological telemetry indicates his heart rate is stabilizing. This is contrary to our agreement." There were complications," Thorne stammered, loosening his silk tie. "The nurse, the military, they brought in outside meds. I couldn't stop them." "We are not interested in your excuses, Julian. We are interested in our investment. The captain knows about the Kandahar operation. If he wakes up and talks to General Ironwood, our organization ceases to exist. And if we cease to exist, your debt is called in immediately." A video file popped up on Thorne's laptop. It was a live feed of a suburban house, Thorne's ex-wife's house. His daughter was sitting in the living room, watching cartoons. Thorne choked back a sob. "No, leave them out of this. You have 1 hour, doctor. Flush him out. If he remains in that fortress of a hospital, we cannot reach him. Get him on the road. We will handle the rest." The line went dead. Thorne stared at the frozen image of his daughter. Fear, cold and sharp, transmuted into a desperate manic resolve. He couldn't kill Sterling in the ICU. Clara and the Rangers were too vigilant. But the voice was right. He had to force them out. He opened the Building Management System, BMS. Mercy General was a smart hospital, a designation Thorne had proudly touted to investors just last month. Now, he would turn its intelligence against it. He navigated to the HVAC control panel. The hospital relied on positive pressure systems to keep germs out of the ICU. Thorne disabled the safety protocols. He ramped the intake fans to 150% capacity, then remotely closed the exhaust dampers. "Burn," he whispered. In the basement, the massive motors shrieked in protest. Friction built up, belts snapped, and then the circuits overloaded. Thorne didn't stop there. He accessed the electrical grid. Mercy General had 3 massive diesel backup generators. He accessed the synchronization panel and scrambled the phase alignment code. Then, he tripped the main city power breaker. In Trauma 1, the lights didn't just go out, they died with a violent crack. The hum of the medical equipment vanished, replaced instantly by the terrifying high-pitched alarms of battery backups. "Report!" General Ironwood barked, his hand instantly on his sidearm. "Main power loss," Sergeant Major Miller shouted, activating the tactical light on his rifle. "Generators should be kicking in. Now." Silence. No hum of diesel engines, no flicker of emergency lights. Just absolute suffocating darkness. Then came the smell. It started as a faint acrid scent, like burning hair, then quickly thickened into the heavy, choking stench of electrical fire. "Smoke!" Clara yelled, checking the display on Sterling's ventilator. "He's running on internal battery. We have 20 minutes of air." "The ventilation system is pushing smoke into the room," Miller realized, shining his light at the ceiling vent. Gray wisps were curling down like snakes. "The intake motors must have caught fire. We're being gassed." "It's sabotage," Ironwood growled. "Thorne." "We can't stay here," Clara said, coughing as the air grew hazy. "Sterling's lungs are compromised. This smoke will kill him faster than the toxin." "We need to move to the nearest military base," Ironwood said. "Joint Base Lewis McChord." "Impossible," Miller countered. "The I-5 corridor is flooded. Bridges are out. We'd never make it." "Then where?" Ironwood slammed his fist against the wall. "We need a sterile environment with power. A safe house." Clara looked at Sterling, illuminated by the flashing red light of the ventilator. She thought of the sea. She thought of isolation. "The lighthouse," she said. Ironwood turned to her. "What?" "My family owns the old Point-No-Point lighthouse on the Kitsap Peninsula," Clara said, her voice steady despite the chaos. "It's decommissioned, but my husband, he was a survivalist. He installed a heavy-duty diesel generator in the basement. It has a separate ventilation system. It's built on a cliff, completely defensible, and it's off the grid. No internet, no digital locks." Ironwood looked at Miller. "Distance?" 20 miles north, Miller calculated. "We can take the back roads. The strikers can ford the mud." "Do it," Ironwood commanded. "Load him up. We leave in 5. Up in the executive suite, Thorne watched the courtyard through a pair of thermal binoculars. The power was out in his office too, but his laptop had a battery. He saw the movement below. The Rangers were scrambling. They were loading a stretcher into the back of a Bearcat armored ambulance, a vehicle softer than a Stryker, designed for medical transport. "They're running," Thorne whispered, a mixture of relief and guilt washing over him. "I did it." He reached for his phone to call the broker, but paused. The broker needed to know where they were going. The convoy would be running dark. No radio comms, no headlights. Thorne looked at his laptop screen. He still had access to the medical device network via the hospital's localized emergency Wi-Fi, which ran on a separate battery loop for critical life support systems. He pulled up the inventory list for Trauma 1. He saw that the stationary Hamilton ventilator had been disconnected. In its place, a new device had come online. Transport Vent Unit 7. Thorne clicked on the device properties. It was a modern piece of tech, designed for field hospitals. It had a built-in cellular modem for remote diagnostics and asset tracking. Standard protocol required this feature to be disabled during covert operations. But in the chaos of a fire, a power outage, and a frantic evacuation, had they remembered to check the settings menu of a breathing machine, Thorne typed in the manufacturer's default backdoor password. Admin. Access granted. He navigated to the Geolocation Services tab. The status read, "Disabled." Thorne smiled. His fingers hovered over the keys. Enable. A loading bar spun for a second. Update complete. On the screen, a small blue dot appeared on the map, pulsing steadily. It was located in the ambulance bay. Thorne picked up his phone. He dialed the number. "They are leaving," Thorne said, his voice trembling. "I can't see where they're going, but I can give you the tracking frequency for his ventilator." "Excellent, doctor," the synthetic voice replied. "Send the code, and consider your interest payment, suspended for the month." The convoy formed up in the driving rain. A striker took the lead, followed by the armored ambulance with a second striker bringing up the rear. Inside the ambulance, it was cramped and cold. The only light came from the glowing screen of the ventilator and the red tactical lights of the two rangers guarding the rear doors. Clara sat on the bench seat, bracing herself against the wall as the vehicle lurched into motion. She held Sterling's hand. His skin was clammy, but the pulse under her fingers felt slightly stronger than before. The serum was working. She looked at the ventilator sitting on the shelf above the stretcher. It was humming rhythmically, pumping oxygen into Sterling's damaged lungs. "You're okay," she whispered to him, though he couldn't hear her over the roar of the engine. "We're going home, to the ocean. The air is clean there." She adjusted the blanket around him. As she did, she noticed a small LED light on the back of the ventilator console. It had been solid green earlier. Now it was blinking blue. Blink, blink, blink. Clara frowned. She knew machines. A blinking blue light usually meant Bluetooth or data transmission. But they were in a Faraday-shielded ambulance. Nothing should be transmitting. "Miller," Clara called out over the comms. "Go ahead, ma'am," Miller's voice crackled in her earpiece. He was in, the lead striker. "The ventilator light changed color," Clara said. "It's blinking blue." "Probably just a battery indicator," Miller replied. "We're moving out. Focus on his vitals." Clara hesitated. She stared at the light. It pulsed with a steady hypnotic rhythm. It felt wrong. It felt like an eye winking at her in the dark. But the ambulance hit a pothole, jarring her bones, and Sterling groaned. Her attention snapped back to the patient. "BP is stable," she reported. "Oxygen saturation, 94%. She let it go. They were surrounded by 2 inches of hardened steel and 20 of the deadliest men on the planet. What could a little blue light do? Outside, the convoy tore out of the hospital gates, splashing through the flooded streets, heading north into the pitch-black night. High above, in the invisible web of signals that blanketed the world, a digital beacon began to sing. It broadcasted their position to a satellite, which bounced the signal down to a secure server in a black site, which then forwarded the coordinates to a squadron of attack helicopters idling on a private airfield 20 miles away. Thorne stood at his window, watching the red taillights of the ambulance disappear into the storm. He finished his scotch in one gulp. "God forgive me," he whispered. But God wasn't listening. Only the devil was on the line. The convoy had navigated the mud-slicked backroads of the Kitsap Peninsula, arriving at Point No Point just as the storm began to violently intensify. The lighthouse stood on a jagged promontory, a solitary white finger accusing the dark sky. It was a structure built to endure the wrath of God, with walls of reinforced concrete and a foundation rooted deep in the basalt bedrock. Inside, the roar of the wind was muffled to a dull, distant moan. The heavy diesel generator in the basement hummed a steady, reassuring rhythm, powering the warm yellow lights of the keeper's quarters. In the center of the living room, which had been converted into a makeshift command center, Captain Elias Sterling sat in a heavy oak armchair. He was off the ventilator, breathing on his own for the first time in days, though his chest heaved with the effort. The polyvalent Series 4 serum had done its work. The paralysis was receding, leaving behind a raw, trembling weakness. Clara Vance stood before him with a pair of medical shears. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the wood fire Sergeant Major Miller had started in the hearth. "It's time, Elias," Clara said softly. "The dressings need to be changed. The risk of infection is high in this humidity." Sterling gripped the arms of the chair, his knuckles white. He turned his head away, staring into the shadows. "Leave them," he rasped. "You don't want to see what's underneath." "I have been a nurse for 30 years, Clara said, her voice firm but gentle. I have seen burns, amputations, and open chest cavities. I doubt you can shock me." "It's not about shock," Sterling whispered, his voice cracking. "It's about looking human. Once you take these off, I'm just a monster." Clara stepped closer. She didn't ask for permission. She reached out and placed a hand on his cheek, right over the thick gauze. "A monster is defined by its actions, Captain, not its skin. You saved your men. You fought for people you didn't know. Now, look at me." Sterling slowly turned his head. His gray eyes were filled with a vulnerability that terrified him more than any enemy bullet. Clara began to cut. Snip, snip. She unwound the layers of white bandage. They fell away like shedding skin. The damage was severe. The chemical burns from the explosion in Kandahar had taken the left side of his face. The skin was a map of angry red ridges and twisted scar tissue that pulled at the corner of his lip and eye. It was raw, brutal, and undeniably permanent. Sterling squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for the gasp. He waited for the flinch, the pity, the subtle recoil he had seen in the eyes of every doctor who had treated him. It never came. Instead, he felt cool fingers tracing the edge of the scar on his jawline. "It is healing well," Clara said clinically, but with a warmth that belied her professional tone. She picked up a warm, damp cloth and began to gently clean the area. "The edges are pink, not red. Good blood flow. You have a strong jaw, Elias. The scars don't hide that." Sterling opened his eyes. Clara wasn't looking at him with horror. She was looking at him with the same focused, caring expression she had worn when she fed him soup. She saw the man, not the ruin. You don't mind it?" Sterling asked, his voice barely audible. "My husband lost 3 fingers in a logging accident," Clara said, applying fresh ointment. "I thought his hand was the most beautiful thing in the world because it was the hand that held mine. This face is the face of a survivor. Wear it like a medal." Sterling let out a breath he felt like he'd been holding for months. For the first time, the tightness in his chest wasn't from the toxin. It was from a sudden, overwhelming release of shame. He leaned his forehead against Clara's stomach, just for a second, a gesture of absolute trust. "Thank you," he whispered. Woof! The sharp bark shattered the moment. Barnaby, the 3-legged golden retriever mix that the Rangers had insisted on bringing along in the ambulance, was standing by the heavy iron door facing the sea. He was bristling, the hair on his back standing up in a ridge. He growled low in his throat, a sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Sergeant Major Miller, who had been cleaning his rifle by the fire, froze. He looked at the dog. "Barnaby doesn't bark at wind." Miller moved to the window, killing the lights in the room instantly. "Flashlights off," he hissed. "Night vision only." He peered through the storm shutters using his NVGs, night vision goggles. The ocean below was a churning cauldron of black and white foam, but through the green phosphor of his goggles, he saw them. Heat signatures. "Contact!" Miller shouted. "Multiple bogies coming up the cliff face. Zodiacs at the waterline. They're using the storm noise to cover their approach." "How did they find us?" Sterling tried to stand, reaching for his sidearm, but his legs buckled. Clara caught him. "The ventilator," Clara realized, a cold dread washing over her. The blue light, it was blinking. Thorne, he tracked the GPS. "We're blown," Miller barked into his radio. "Defensive positions, they're breaching the perimeter." There were only 4 Rangers, Miller and 3 operators named Davila, Jens, and Rook. They were elite, but they were exhausted, and they were guarding a civilian structure against an unknown number of mercenaries. "They'll come through the service entrance and the main light deck," Sterling said, his voice shifting from invalid to commander instantly. "Miller, take the deck. Davila, secure the generator room. Rook, Jens, cover the front." "What about me?" Clara asked. "You stay down," Sterling ordered. "Get in the pantry. Lock the door." "No," Clara said. She looked around the kitchen. "You have 4 guns. They have a platoon. You need a force multiplier." "We don't have claymores, ma'am," Miller grunted, racking the slide of his rifle. "I don't need claymores," Clara said, her eyes scanning the shelves under the sink in the pantry. She saw a jug of ammonia. She saw a bag of pool shock, calcium hypochlorite, for the old cistern. She saw a bag of powdered sugar and a container of potassium nitrate stump remover her late husband used for gardening. "I have chemistry," she said. Clara moved with a speed that startled the soldiers. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet and a metal mixing bowl. "Miller, how long until they breach the door?" she asked, pouring the stump remover into the skillet and placing it on the gas stove. 2 minutes, Miller shouted as the first pane of glass shattered upstairs. Gunfire erupted. The dry crack, crack, crack of suppressed rifles. "I need sugar," Clara muttered, dumping the white powder into the melting nitrate. "And I need duct tape." She was making a smoke bomb, a crude, unstable, but massive smoke bomb. The mixture turned into a thick brown goo. She scraped it into empty soup cans, stuck a piece of magnesium sparkler, left over from the 4th of July, into each as a fuse, and taped them shut. "Miller," Clara yelled, "the stairwell. If they come up, they'll have night vision. Blind them." She tossed 2 of the soup cans to the giant soldier. "Light the fuse and throw it. It's not military grade, but it burns white hot, and the smoke is thick enough to choke a horse." Miller looked at the homemade device, then at Clara. He grinned. "Yes, ma'am." Upstairs, the heavy oak door splintered. "Breach! Breach!" Miller lit the sparkler and hurled the can down the spiral staircase. F, Z, zis. The can didn't explode. It erupted. A massive billowing cloud of dense, acrid white smoke roared up the stairwell, instantly filling the narrow passage. "Gas! Gas!" a mercenary voice screamed from below. "I can't see! My thermals are white out." "Now!" Sterling ordered from his chair. "Fire into the smoke." The Rangers unleashed hell. They fired blindly into the white void, the bullets ricocheting off the stone walls. Screams echoed as the mercenaries, blinded and choking on the caramelized sugar and nitrate smoke, fell over each other. "They're falling back from the stairs," Miller reported, "but they're flanking to the kitchen windows." "The trap," Clara said. She grabbed a bottle of cooking oil and a bag of flour. "Davila, break the window." "What?" Davila asked, crouching by the kitchen island. "Break it." Davila smashed the glass. A mercenary appeared, raising a rifle. Clara hurled the bag of flour into the air. It burst, filling the space in front of the window with a fine white dust. "Fire!" Clara screamed, ducking behind the refrigerator. Davila fired a single shot. The muzzle flash ignited the suspended flour particles. Boom! It wasn't a grenade, but the dust explosion was powerful enough to blow the window frame outward. The mercenary was thrown back off the porch, his eyebrows singed, his weapon flying from his hands. "Holy hell!" Davila coughed, staring at the nurse. "Did you just weaponize biscuits?" "It's physics," Clara said, dusting flour off her apron. She moved to Sterling's side, checking his pulse. It was racing, but he was alive. He was grinning, a feral, terrifying grin of a wolf who had found his pack. "You see that, boys?" Sterling shouted over the gunfire. "That is why she's in charge. Hold the line. Don't let them touch her." The lighthouse shook as an RPG hit the outer wall, but the fortress held. Inside, amidst the smoke and the noise, an unlikely alliance. 4 super soldiers, a crippled captain, a 3-legged dog, and a middle-aged nurse with a chemistry set, prepared to make their final stand. The ammunition was gone. The realization hit Sergeant Major Miller with the hollow click of his firing pin striking empty air. He dropped the magazine, reaching for a pouch that felt terrifyingly light. Around him, the kitchen of the keeper's quarters was a ruin. The flour explosion from earlier had coated everything in a ghostly white dust, now streaked with soot and blood. The air was thick with the chemical stench of burnt sugar and cordite. "Last mag!" Davila shouted from behind the overturned sofa, clutching a bleeding shoulder. "They're massing at the breach. I count 6 heat signatures." Captain Sterling sat in the command chair, his face gray, sweat cutting channels through the flour on his skin. He held his pistol, a Sig Sauer P320, with a 2-handed grip that trembled not from fear, but from the neurotoxin still warring with his nervous system. "Clara," Sterling said, his voice low, "get behind the stove. If they come through, stay low." "I'm not hiding in the oven, Elias," Clara said. She was crouching beside him, holding a heavy red cylinder, the industrial fire extinguisher she had pulled from the hallway bracket. Her knuckles were white against the red metal. "We hold the line together." Before Sterling could argue, the barricaded door exploded. It wasn't a breach charge, it was a battering ram of sheer kinetic force. The heavy oak, weakened by the previous assault, splintered inward. Wood shards flew like shrapnel. Through the smoke, a figure emerged. He didn't rush in like the grunts. He walked. He was a wraith of a man, clad in high-end charcoal tactical gear that cost more than a house. He wore no helmet, revealing a shaved head and a face devoid of emotion, pale as death. This was Voron, the field commander of the PMC unit, a man whose reputation in the underworld was built on silence and efficiency. He stepped over the debris, a suppressed carbine raised to his shoulder. He scanned the room, ignoring Miller and Davila, who were pinned down by suppressive fire from the doorway. Voron's eyes locked onto Sterling. "Captain," Voron said. His voice was calm, almost bored. "The broker sends his regards." He raised the rifle, aiming directly at Sterling's chest. Sterling tried to lift his pistol. His arm, heavy as lead, rose agonizingly slow. The paralysis was ghosting back, triggered by the extreme stress. He wasn't going to be fast enough. He saw the black hole of Voron's muzzle. He saw the end. Whoosh! A white blizzard erupted from the shadows. Clara didn't scream. She didn't hesitate. She had pulled the pin on the fire extinguisher and, with a strength born of pure maternal desperation, squeezed the trigger, aiming the nozzle not at the fire, but at Voron's face. A high-pressure jet of monoammonium phosphate and freezing CO2 blasted into the assassin's eyes. Voron roared, stumbling back. The chemical cloud blinded him instantly, coating his optics and filling his lungs with choking powder. He fired blindly, the bullets tearing into the ceiling. "Now!" Clara screamed, swinging the heavy steel cylinder like a medieval mace. She slammed the bottom of the extinguisher into Voron's ribs. The impact was sickeningly solid. The assassin grunted, doubling over, his tactical discipline shattered by the sheer unpredictability of a middle-aged nurse attacking him. He lashed out, a backhand strike that caught Clara on the cheekbone. Clara flew backward, crashing into the kitchen cabinets. She slid to the floor, dazed, blood trickling from her temple. Voron blinked the powder from his red, streaming eyes. He raised his weapon toward Clara. "Stupid Crack! Crack!" 2 shots rang out. Voron stiffened. A look of genuine surprise crossed his face. He looked down at the 2 dark blossoms expanding on the center of his chest rig. The armor stopped bullets, but it didn't stop physics. The force knocked him off balance. Crack! The 3rd shot was higher, above the plate carrier, straight into the throat. Voron dropped his rifle. He fell to his knees, then face-planted into the flour-covered floor, motionless. Behind him, Elias Sterling lowered his smoking pistol. He hadn't aimed with his muscles. He had aimed with his will. He slumped back into the chair, the weapon slipping from his numb fingers. "Clara!" he wheezed. Clara pushed herself up. The room was spinning. She crawled over to him, ignoring the throbbing pain in her face. "I'm here. I'm okay." Check the perimeter," Sterling ordered Miller. "Targets are retreating," Miller yelled, peering through the shattered window. "They saw the commander go down. They're pulling back to the boats." But the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. "They're not leaving," Sterling said, closing his eyes. "They're regrouping for a mortar strike. They'll level the building." "We need the cavalry," Clara said. She looked up at the ceiling, toward the lantern room. "The radio is dead. The GPS beacon brought them here, but we destroyed the ventilator. Ironwood doesn't know we're under attack." "The light," Sterling said. "Light the lamp." "The electric motor is shot," Miller said. "Then we do it the old way," Clara said. She stood up, swaying slightly. "Help him up." Miller and Davila hoisted Sterling. Together, the battered group made the agonizing climb up the spiral stairs to the lantern room. The glass of the lighthouse dome was shattered, the wind howling through the iron skeleton. The massive Fresnel lens, a jewel of glass and brass, sat dark in the center. Clara found the emergency supply locker. She pulled out a jerry can of kerosene and a flare. "Soak the rags," she commanded the Rangers. "Put them inside the lens cage. It will amplify the light." They worked feverishly, stuffing oil-soaked tactical vests and blankets into the focal point of the massive lens. "Stand back," Clara said. She struck the flare. She tossed it in. Whoosh! The fire caught instantly. The flames danced inside the crystal prison of the Fresnel lens. The optics, designed 100 years ago to guide ships through the fog, now did something else. They took the chaotic firelight and focused it into a single piercing beam of amber brilliance. It cut through the storm, a finger of fire pointing out to sea, then sweeping across the dark sky. Flash, pause, flash, the SOS of the ancients. Minutes passed. The team huddled on the catwalk, shivering. Then the sound came. It wasn't the roar of the ocean. It was the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of rotors. "Look," Davila pointed. Out of the pre-dawn gray, shapes materialized. Not just one helicopter, a swarm. MH-60, Blackhawks and AH-64 Apaches, flying low and fast, skimming the wave tops. The lead Apache unleashed a stream of tracer fire toward the beach below, decimating the fleeing mercenary boats. The sky lit up with the dawn of man-made thunder. "Ironwood," Sterling whispered, a smile breaking through the grime on his face. "He brought the whole damn regiment." The rescue was swift. The Blackhawks hovered over the rocky promontory, ropes dropping, PJs, para-rescue men, sliding down. "Secure the package," a PJ shouted, rushing toward them. "I can walk," Sterling growled, pushing away the medic who tried to put him on a stretcher. He looked at Clara. She was leaning against the railing, her face pale, the bruise on her cheek turning purple. She looked small, fragile, and utterly exhausted. Sterling stepped toward her. He didn't offer her a hand. He offered her his side. "Lean on me," he said. The same words she had said to him on the rainy highway days ago. Clara looked up at him. She saw the scars, the blood, the uniform torn to shreds. She saw the son she couldn't save and the man she had. She stepped in, wrapping her arm around his waist. He wrapped his massive arm around her shoulders, pulling her tight against his side. "We walked together," Clara whispered. They moved toward the stairs. Sterling, the giant ranger, took the brunt of the wind, shielding Clara with his body. He matched his stride to hers. He was her shield. She was his anchor. They descended the lighthouse tower and stepped out onto the muddy grass. The storm was breaking. To the east, a thin line of gold cracked the horizon, the dawn. The scene that greeted them silenced the wind. General Ironwood had landed. He stood by the lead helicopter. Behind him, 2 platoons of Rangers had formed up. They weren't in a defensive perimeter anymore. They were in formation. 2 lines of soldiers, standing rigid in the mud, creating a corridor leading to the helicopter. As Sterling and Clara stepped forward, Ironwood shouted a single command. "Present! Arms!" The snap of 50 rifles hitting palms echoed like a gunshot. 50 hands rose in a crisp salute. They weren't saluting the captain. They were saluting the woman beside him. Sterling didn't limp. He drew strength from the woman under his arm, straightened his spine, and walked. Clara, the fired nurse with the broken notebook and the bruised face, held her head high. They walked through the corridor of giants. No one cheered. The silence was heavy with a respect that transcended rank. As they reached the general, Ironwood didn't bark orders. He stepped forward, removed his patrol cap, and extended a hand to Clara. "Mrs. Vance," Ironwood said, his voice thick with emotion, "your shift is over. We'll take it from here." Clara looked back at the lighthouse, the fire still burning in the lens, and then at the sunrise bleeding into the sky. She squeezed Sterling's hand one last time. "About time," she said, and for the first time in a week, she let herself close her eyes as the medic wrapped a warm blanket around her shoulders. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle was a monolith of glass and steel, gleaming under a sky that had finally decided to clear. The great storm was over, leaving the city washed clean, but inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere remained heavy with the static charge of an approaching judgment. Dr. Julian Thorne sat at the defense table, looking like a man who had already won. He wore a navy suit that cost more than most nurses earned in a year, his hair perfectly coiffed, his hands resting calmly on a stack of legal pads. Beside him sat his attorney, Marcus Kincaid, a man with a shark smile and a reputation for burying the truth under mountains of paperwork. Across the aisle, the prosecution team looked exhausted. They had the narrative, but they lacked the digital smoking gun. "Your Honor," Kincaid stood, buttoning his jacket. "We move for immediate dismissal. The prosecution alleges that my client altered medical records and sabotaged hospital infrastructure. Yet, after 3 weeks of forensic analysis by the FBI, no digital footprint exists, no server logs, no deleted files. The supposed hack of the ventilator is speculation. What we have here is a witch hunt led by the military to cover up their own operational failures." Thorne allowed a small, sympathetic smile to touch his lips. He looked at the jury. He looked at the gallery, filled with reporters. He was playing the part of the victimized professional perfectly. "The prosecution has nothing," Kincaid concluded, "except the testimony of a disgruntled, terminated employee with a history of insubordination." The judge, a stern woman named Holloway, with reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, looked at the prosecutor. "Counsel, unless you have physical evidence, I am inclined to agree." The prosecutor, a young woman who looked like she hadn't slept in a week, stood up. "The people call Clara Vance to the stand." Thorne chuckled softly. He leaned over to Kincaid. "Let her talk. She's a relic. She'll ramble about feelings and intuition. The jury will laugh her out of the room." Clara entered the courtroom. She wasn't wearing scrubs today. She wore a simple Sunday dress and the same worn cardigan she had worn the night she walked down the highway. She walked to the witness stand with a quiet dignity, her chin held high. She swore the oath. She sat down. "Mrs. Vance," the prosecutor began, "can you tell the court what happened on the night of November 14th? "I was caring for Captain Elias Sterling," Clara said, her voice clear and steady. "Dr. Thorne ordered his eviction. Later, he attempted to kill him by altering the medication codes in the dispensing unit." Kincaid shot up. "Objection! Hearsay! Speculation! Mrs. Vance is not a computer engineer. She cannot know what the machine was doing." "Sustained," Judge Holloway said. "Mrs. Vance, stick to what you observed." "I observed," Clara said, turning to look directly at Thorne, "that the vial dispensed was potassium chloride, not epinephrine." "And where is the proof?" Kincaid sneered, bypassing protocol to address her directly. "The vial was destroyed. The machine logs show epinephrine was dispensed. The logs were scrubbed. Convenient. Every piece of data says you were lying, Mrs. Vance. In this century, if it isn't recorded in the system, it didn't happen." Thorne smirked. This was the checkmate. The digital void was his shield. Clara reached into her large tote bag sitting by her feet. "You are right, Mr. Kincaid," Clara said softly. "Computers can be wiped, logs can be deleted, but ink is stubborn." She pulled out the notebook. It was a battered thing. The cover was warped from the rain. The pages were crinkled from being submerged in the Sodo warehouse flood. It smelled of mildew and old paper. It was the same notebook Thorne had thrown on the floor in Chapter 1. The same notebook he had mocked as a relic. "Exhibit A," Clara said, placing it on the railing. "What is this?" Kincaid asked, losing his smile. "This is my patient log," Clara said. "For 30 years, I have kept a manual backup of every patient I treat. I write down the time, the vitals, the medication administered, and the behavior of the staff." The prosecutor seized the moment. "Mrs. Vance, please read the entry for 03 User hours on November 15th. Clara put on her reading glasses. She opened the water-stained book. The ink had run slightly, but the handwriting, looping, precise, and disciplined, was indelible. "Entry 03.0, Clara read. "Patient Sterling stable. Nurse Emily attempts to administer medication dispensed by ADC Unit 4. Vial cap is black with red lettering. Visual ID confirms potassium chloride concentrate. Digital screen on Unit 4 reads epinephrine. I intervened. Note, Dr. Thorne was observed accessing the server room remotely at 02:45. Note, ventilation system set to intake-only mode at 03.15. Manually overridden from executive suite IP address." The courtroom went silent. That's fabricated," Thorne blurted out, standing up. "She wrote that later." "We can carbon date ink, doctor," the prosecutor said coldly. and we can match the handwriting style to 30 years of previous journals Mrs. Vance has provided. This is a contemporaneous record. Clara flipped the page. I also wrote down the serial number of the ventilator you swapped, doctor, and the IP address I saw on your laptop screen when I came to your office to beg for the captain's life. I have a habit of writing down numbers. It's an old nurse's trick. Thorne's legs gave out. He sat down hard. He had erased the servers. He had wiped the cameras. He had scrubbed the cloud. But he had forgotten the one thing he deemed obsolete: a pen. He had been defeated not by a supercomputer, but by a 50-cent ballpoint and the diligence of a woman he considered beneath him. The defense rests, Kincaid whispered, closing his briefcase. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Thorne looked at Clara. For the first time, he didn't look down on her. He looked up at her, terrified, realizing that the relic was actually a monolith. 1 month later, the morning sun over Seattle was crisp and bright, turning the puddles on the street into mirrors. Clara stood in the middle of her small apartment. It was empty. The boxes were packed. She picked up the framed photo of her late son, Michael, and wrapped it carefully in newspaper. She was tired. The trial had been a whirlwind. Thorne had been sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder and domestic terrorism. The hospital board had resigned. Clara had been offered her job back, with a promotion, a raise, and a corner office. She had turned it down. "Come on, Barnaby," she said to the three-legged dog thumping his tail by the door. "Time to go." She walked out of the apartment building, carrying her last box. She expected to call a cab. Instead, she dropped the box. The street was blocked. It wasn't a blockade of war this time. It was a blockade of gratitude. Lined up along both sides of the street were soldiers, not in tactical gear, but in dress blues. 2 platoons of the 1st Ranger Battalion stood at attention, the brass buttons on their uniforms gleaming in the sun. In the center of the street, leaning against a vehicle that looked like a spaceship on wheels, stood Elias Sterling. He was in uniform, his chest heavy with medals. The scar on his face was visible, uncovered. He didn't hide it anymore. He wore it just as Clara had told him to, like a medal. "Captain," Clara smiled, walking down the steps. "I thought I told you to rest that leg." "I'm following orders, ma'am," Sterling grinned, the expression making his scars crinkle. "Doctor's orders, but I had one last mission to complete." He stepped aside, revealing the vehicle behind him. It was an RV, but to call it an RV was an insult. It was a Prius luxury motor coach, 45 feet of gleaming silver and black steel. It was a land yacht, equipped with solar panels, satellite internet, and every comfort known to man. "Elias?" Clara gasped. "What is this?" "We took up a collection," Sterling said softly. "The battalion, the general, and, well, the asset forfeiture form from Thorne's estate came through. We figured since he tried to kill us, we might as well spend his money." He handed her a set of keys. "You spent your whole life walking, Clara," Sterling said, his voice thick with emotion. "You walked to work. You walked in the rain. You walked down a highway to save my life when everyone else looked away. You carried me when I couldn't stand." He closed her fingers around the keys. "You don't have to walk anymore, Mom. The world is big. Go see it. Let the wheels do the work." Clara looked at the massive vehicle. She looked at the soldiers saluting her. She looked at Barnaby, who was already sniffing the tires of his new chariot. Tears pricked her eyes, but they weren't sad tears. They were the tears of a burden finally being set down. "It's too much," she whispered. "It's just a down payment," Sterling said, kissing her on the cheek. "Check the glove box. There's a map. I marked all the best fishing spots in Montana. Ironwood says the trout are biting." Clara laughed. She opened the door of the RV. Barnaby hopped in effortlessly. She climbed into the driver's seat. It smelled of new leather and possibility. She rolled down the window. "Will you be okay?" she asked Sterling. He tapped the scar on his face. "I'm healing, thanks to you." Clara started the engine. It didn't roar like a tank. It purred like a contented cat. "Goodbye, Elias," she said. "Not goodbye," Sterling corrected, stepping back and snapping a salute. "Just end of shift. We'll be watching over you, Clara. Always." Clara shifted the massive vehicle into gear. She honked the horn. a deep, resonant blast that echoed off the buildings. The Rangers broke formation, cheering, throwing caps into the air. As she drove down the street, watching the city of Seattle fade in her rearview mirror, Clara Vance didn't look back at the hospital, or the courthouse, or the pain. She looked forward at the open road, stretching out like a ribbon of gold under the sun. She turned on the radio. A familiar folk song began to play. She hummed along, her voice strong and free. I'm just a poor, wayfaring stranger, traveling through this world of woe. But there's no sickness, toil, or danger in that bright land to which I go. The nurse who walked with giants was finally, truly walking home. This story reminds us that in a world obsessed with speed, technology, and status, the most powerful force is still human kindness. Dr. Thorne had all the power, the money, and the machines, but he lost because he lacked a heart. Clara had nothing but a notebook and a stubborn refusal to give up on a stranger. We often think we need to be rich or powerful to make a difference. But the truth is, you don't need a uniform to be a hero. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply hold someone's hand when they are scared, or stay when everyone else walks away. Never underestimate the value of your own compassion. In a world full of noise, be the quiet strength that someone else can lean on. Heavenly Father, I lift up every person listening to this story right now. Just as you sent guardians to protect Clara and Elias in the midst of the storm, I pray that you would surround my viewers with your divine protection. When they feel weak, be their strength. When they feel forgotten, remind them that they are seen and loved. Give them the courage to face their battles with grace, and the wisdom to know that they never walk alone. If you believe that God is walking with you through your own storm today, please write Amen in the comments below to claim this blessing. If Clara's journey touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this story with a friend who might need a reminder that hope is never lost. And if you want to hear more powerful tales of resilience, justice, and faith, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We have many more stories to tell, and we want you to be part of our family. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you.